Thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see that we not only have faculty today, but students, people from the community. As you may know, this is of course a colloquium, but it's also part of our Applied Behavior Analysis Awareness Week. And we're having a whole series of events this week. We have another event tomorrow about ABA and how can it be used to optimize horse training. That's a relatively unusual talk, but that will be the last event for our Awareness Week. During this week, our star visitor is being Dr. Greg Hanley. He's given a workshop for us. He just finished a discussion session on translational research with students, and Doug Ellis was also co-sharing that event. Yesterday he gave a university public lecture. We have had a full house. The lecture was actually featured in the Herald, so now you're famous in New Zealand. And so we're very fortunate to having Greg here with us this week. The theme, or the topic of today's lecture, it's I think a very interesting one, and very unlike the topics that have been presented these past few days. He's going to talk about stereotypy, apparently non-functional, repetitive motor behaviors that we often see in individuals with developmental and intellectual disability, but behaviors that we also engage in. Anybody with typical development would, one time or another, engage in stereotypy. Stereotypy is a very interesting behavior from a behavioral standpoint, just because of the number of times it repeats itself. So it lends itself to research easily from that perspective, because it's easy to observe, it's easy to see it happen many times. However, at the same time, it's a very challenging behavior to modify, because of the fact that on most occasions, the behavior is maintained by its sensory products. So we do not have access to the environmental event that is maintaining that behavior, and that makes it challenging to modify in clinical settings. Greg today is going to tell us about some research that he's been doing in this area, and hopefully we'll learn about novel approaches to assessment and treatment of stereotypy. So a little bit about Greg. He got his PhD at the University of Florida under Dr. Brian Iwata, probably one of the most renowned scholars in our field. Currently, he is the director of the PhD program in Applied Behavior Analysis at Western New England University in Springfield, Massachusetts. He's also affiliated with the Psychiatry Department of the University of Massachusetts. And at his current post, he directs two clinics, one on life skills and another one on sleep disorders of children, a topic about which he presented last night. And part of his research is also conducted at the New England Center for Children, one of the best known and most reputed clinical programs in applied behavior analysis in the United States. He is extremely prolific. Just to give you an indication, he's published over 70 papers at the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, the flagship journal of our field, and he's currently the editor of that journal. And that appointment is it's very rare to have the honor of being the editor of JAVA. So I think that summarizes the proficiency that he's achieved academically, but at the same time he's an accomplished physician, an engaging presenter, and a very impressive teacher, as we've been able to see over the last few days. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hanley.
I'm really appreciative to Dr. Virues-Ortega, for this opportunity to come to New Zealand. And it took a little bit for this to happen, and Javier has just been wonderful, so supportive. And this trip has been too short for the flight. I should be staying here longer, but I couldn't. But I've really been able to put in a lot of stuff. We've been hiking and biking and having great food and meeting super people, and so it's really been a wonderful stay. So thank you so much, and thank you for everyone else for the great conversations we've had. Yesterday, I felt terrible because I went over on time. Or said another way, I didn't get through all my slides. So I'm really going to try to be on task today and not be interactive. I'm not a good lecturer. I very rarely do I stand in front of people and talk. I interact. That's how I teach. That's how I do workshops, seminars, trainings. It's very hard for me just to talk, but I'm going to do my best to not ask you to behave at all, so I can stay on task and get to the end of talk, which is really some exciting technology. I've struggled with helping families manage, if you will, stereotypic behavior of their child with autism or adults with autism in residential care. We've always been able to move the behavior around a little bit, but really very rarely get a satisfying outcome. And so I didn't talk about stereotypy for a long time. I've done research on it, but I never really presented on it. But I'm starting to do that now because I'm really happy with the kind of socially meaningful effects we're getting. And so I want to get through the talk so I can make sure I share with you those effects. So let's start with some definitions. Persons with autism often engage in these repetitive acts. And we call these repetitive acts stereotypy. As a field, we used to define them as behaviors that serve no function, that serve no purpose. But we know that that's really a misnomer because they do indeed serve a purpose. They do indeed serve a purpose, a function for folks. So we really define them now simply by their form. These are behaviors that have formal similarity. In other words, the person engages in the behavior and it looks the same way time after time, day after day, year after year. So there's this formal similarity to the behavior, and then it has some temporal periodicity. There's some rate or rhythm to these behaviors. So I'm going to be talking about behaviors like hand flapping, body rocking, okay, moving their fingers in their clothing, wrapping up their fingers in clothing, flicking at lint in the air. So a lot of gross motor movement, and sometimes it takes the form of vocal behavior. So there are these noises that repeat, and they have formal similarity and some kind of rhythm or temporal periodicity to them. We call these acts, again, stereotypy, the stereotypic behavior. I'm going to show you this chart here. This was done by a medical professional in the States, a research project, and this was his measurement system. I show it to you because it's a nice description of the kind of behaviors I'm going to be talking about today. So these are typical stereotypies, and then the clients I talk about today, these are the kind of behaviors they engaged in with regularity. What's interesting about the study that this gentleman did was he had samples where he would observe people in different categories. So he had people with high functioning autism, meaning they had diagnosed with autism, were diagnosed with autism, but also had high IQ. And he had what he called low functioning autism on the spectrum, but less IQ. And then he had folks with developmental disabilities matched for age, and folks matched with normal IQ. And what he found was that when he watched these folks, and he did some nice direct observation, which was good, and a fair amount of sampling, he found that independent of functioning level, that stereotypy was routinely higher in persons with autism. And so understand that this is in fact a diagnostic attribute of folks on the spectrum, and that is, in a general sense, a need for sameness, but in a more specific sense, it's often these stereotypic behaviors is one of the behavioral indices of autism. Said another way, it's one of the behaviors folks engage in to get that label we know now as autism. Most people think these behaviors are maintained by their sensory products. So let's just make that clear. Why are they doing it? We hear a lot about the function of behavior. Why are folks engaging in these motoric behaviors? And we think it's not because they're not trying to get anything in the environment nor get out of doing things, but it's maintained by the sensory products, the direct function of the behavior. Okay, the direct effect on the environment is the reinforcer. But I'm going to talk about the behaviors that are indeed probably maintained by those sort of reinforcers primarily today. But I just want to put a little cautionary tale out there. And when we reviewed the literature, this is dated, but about 15 years ago, we reviewed all the functional analyses of stereotypic behavior that have been published to date. We actually found that a fair amount of stereotypic behavior appears sensitive to social reinforcers. Okay, I've met many children that when you get close to them, you see the behavior start to really tick up, and you get closer and you see the rhythm escalate. And then as you move further away, the rhythm de-escalates. And as you move out of the space entirely, the visual field, the behavior stops. This behavior is often a learned behavior. It's a way to move people around the social environment, often get away from me. So it does serve sometimes a social or communicative function, but it's fairly rare. So I am going to focus now on just stereotypic behavior that appears to be maintained by its sensory products. Okay. Let's talk about when it's a problem. Javier mentioned very quickly that we all engage in stereotypy. Now, you folks are incredibly peaceful right now. I don't know what kind of medications you're on, but nevertheless, there's not a lot of stereotypy going on right now. But many people are moving their legs. Some people twiddle their jewelry or move their pens around. That's, if you will, some sort of stereotypic behavior. But we all tend to grow out of it. If you look at early infant studies, my wife and I ran a child development center for 8 years. The infants all engaged in high levels of stereotypic behavior. Head lolling, kids rocking their heads against the crib. They would move their hands in rhythmic patterns, sometimes even making contact with their head. Very normal, typical development. The difference is kids with autism, that behavior persists. They get exceptionally good at it, refined at it, if you will. By contrast, typically developing kids, more behavior gets picked up by the social environment and presumably knocking out that stereotypic behavior. But the question really is, as an interventionist as I am, when do you treat? I mean, when do you impose your will, the parent's will on a child and try to manage that behavior? That again is a fairly victimless behavior, is it not? It's simply repetitive behavior that looks unique in our culture. So I just want to point out the three conditions under which we often treat this behavior. The first, when it's exhibited with impairing frequency. I want to make it clear that is not one of the reasons we treat. This is often written in research articles. There is no magic number. Is 400 impairing? Is 600 impairing? So we're really looking for the social validation of the problem. Here are the three reasons. First, when it interferes with attempts to teach concepts and skills. Autism, in a nutshell, requires a lot of teaching. You have to program the environment, break down skills typically developing people learn by accident, and you have to break down those skills and teach them with some fairly precise teaching. That, in a nutshell, is the challenge related to autism. And so when you're attempting to teach so many things, and when you attempt to do so, there's this repetitive behavior getting in the way that's taking the learner away from the materials or away from the interactions that promote learning. Those are some conditions under which we attempt to treat stereotypy. Oftentimes it appears with social interactions. One of my colleagues and mentors is a gentleman named Todd Risley. He used to describe social interactions as a beautiful waltz. It's like this nice interaction between two people where there's an exchange of lead and following. And often when a child with autism, there's not a big waltz going on. There's a lot of popping and body crunking, if you know what I'm talking about. If you watch dance shows, there's a lot of solo behavior going on. So when you're trying to teach that waltz, and there's a lot of solo acts going on, that too are the conditions under which we treat stereotypy. But perhaps the most compelling reason to treat it is when parents try to manage it, when teachers try to manage it, when they try to dissuade it by quieting the child's hands or perhaps reprimanding them for that behavior that is maybe unfortunate in social situations. That then evokes more serious behavior. So I often meet kids with chronic stereotypy because they're engaging in aggressive or self-injurious behavior when people try to prevent them from engaging in stereotypic behavior. These are the conditions under which we treat. I'm going to speak first from this article. This was published in 2013 in JABA, and I'm going to break down this article. And this is our first attempt, not our first attempt, this is one of several studies on stereotypy, but this was really our first attempt to make clinically important differences in this level of behavior. I want to make it very clear, that which I describe in this article was only published a few years ago, is not what I do right now as a practitioner, but it makes some important points. Then I'm going to tell you the next level intervention, and then I'm finally going to close on what we actually do in practice, okay? Okay. I'm going to start talking through our three consecutive case studies. This was John, Patrick, and Edward were all adolescents, all between 13 and 17. They all engaged in chronic levels of these behaviors. These young men did not self-feed. These young men did not have any play skills. These young men did not speak with words. They had an exceptionally limited communication repertoire. They were incredibly disabled, okay? And it was primarily at least partly, but probably primarily due to their chronic stereotypy. They spent every second engaging in these behaviors. And if you tried to prohibit one behavior, another behavior would come online. They would shake their foot or move their hands through space and whatnot. So this is chronic stereotypy that clearly inhibited learning. We do what we call a functional analysis. Basically, in this analysis, we're trying to understand if this behavior is sensitive to the social environment anymore. If we reprimand that behavior, does it increase in rate? In other words, is it sensitive to attention as reinforcement? Are they doing it perhaps just to get out of work? I'm sure a lot of people have been instructing these folks because they don't have many skills. Perhaps they're doing it to get out of work. What we found, and I'm not going to unpack these data much, is simply that it occurs a lot in the alone condition. In other words, there's no change in the environment, yet this behavior persists. So it doesn't seem to be paying off in any social sort of way, yet it persists. And our default interpretation is that it must be maintained then by the direct products of the behavior. Please understand it's not an experimental demonstration of that, it's simply a default assumption based on these patterns in a functional analysis. And we see similar patterns for these three adolescents. So our conclusion is it's maintained by what some people call automatic reinforcement. Okay, not social reinforcement, but automatic reinforcement. So the first step you might consider when trying to treat this sort of behavior is conducting what people call a preference assessment. We're going to try to identify materials that these folks can engage with that might provide sensory reinforcers that compete with or are substitutable for the sensory reinforcers produced by their own behavior. And there's some articles in the literature suggesting this is an effective tactic. So we did that with these gentlemen. We measured engagement with items that the teachers told us were probably preferred, although it was hard to identify things. The problem, however, is as they did touch the materials, which is how we define engagement. It's a fairly low caliber measure. But they also engage with stereotypy with all the materials. So these are the kind of folks, and if you do applied work, you may have met these folks, where when you hand them anything, they engage in stereotypy with that thing. Okay, they shake it and flip it and flop it. And so the reinforcers from materials, the best we could find, did not substitute nor compete with the reinforcers directly produced by that behavior. So we're going to move on to our next step. Our next step is we're going to teach, we're going to prompt, we're going to try to teach them how to derive the sensory reinforcers from these sensory toys. Okay? So I'll start showing you some direct data now. So these are data for one of the gentlemen. Let me orient you to the graph. This is stereotypy responses per minute. So he engages in average about 8 stereotypic responses per minute. Now please understand, whenever you do research on stereotypy, you're capturing but a sample. They could be twiddling their toes and shaking their legs and whatnot, but we capture the sample of the most objective or perhaps intrusive topographies, and that's what we're measuring here. You can see that we have toys out. It's called the activities condition, but they're not. This gentleman's not engaging the toys. When we prompt him to engage the toys, and by prompting, what I mean is we model. We say, look, do this. You do it. If they don't do it in a few seconds, we take their hands and teach them physically how to manipulate the toys in particular ways. So we add prompts. We see a little bit of engagement, but you can see it's clearly under the prompt control. But we see no difference in stereotypy. It's continuing at the same rate. These are data for a second gentleman, Edward. We see has a lower base rate of stereotypy, but it continues in the same rate despite prompting. We see he's touching the toys, but again, he's the kind of character that's now engaging in stereotypy with the toys. So, the conclusion. We're prompting play, but the play is clearly not producing reinforcers as important as the sensory reinforcers. Okay, this is a tale that's told all the time with stereotypy. It's almost the most important reinforcer for most of these folks. So what do we do next? The literature might suggest that we use sensory extinction or blocking the response. And this is very common in day-to-day interactions with kids with autism engaged in chronic stereotypy. People are constantly quieting their hands, pushing their hands down. We call it blocking. So please understand what it looks like. If someone were to attempt to do this, the hand goes up and the hand is quiet. So it's not a karate chop, it's just putting the hands down, okay? And as far as the processes, there's a study showing that this can be effective. It may be effective because it's a punisher, and all I mean by that, it's an event that follows a behavior that decreases its frequency, and it could be that. It could be sensory extinction. So if the behavior is to produce some sort of visual stimulation and you block that behavior, you're no longer providing the reinforcer, and so perhaps you're going to see an extinction effect. Regardless, it's been shown to be effective. Let's see how it works here. For this gentleman, as we blocked, we saw absolutely no change in behavior. If anything, we saw a slight increase in the rate. We did see some concomitant increase in the play behavior and therefore necessitating less prompting. As we continued out the phase, we saw absolutely no change in the rate of behavior. If anything, we saw an increase in the rate. The white circles bring us back to this baseline condition, and we're seeing absolutely no difference in the rate of stereotypy when we're blocking. So understand, we are, every time the child attempts, the young man attempts, the analyst is moving their hands down, and she's very good at it. She's very fast. The integrity is pretty darn good. Nevertheless, we see no decrease. We do see more play behavior when prompting and blocking is in place than we did when it's just the activities only, but nevertheless, this is nowhere near a therapeutic outcome. For the other gentleman, we saw a much clearer increase in the rate of behavior with blocking. Okay. We saw, if anything, a concomitant decrease in play behavior. So, why? Why does blocking not work? We have a fair amount of literature suggesting it should. Why does it not work? Could be that stereotypy is maintained by some sort of tension, physical tension perhaps. Perhaps we're paying off the behavior. I don't think that's the case because our analysis suggested that wasn't the case. Could be because we're only seeing the early stages of extinction. If blocking works as a sensory extinction process, perhaps it needs to be implemented longer. Now you saw there was a lot of sessions there. Nevertheless, perhaps with more experience, we might see that nice extinction curve. It could be that we're not removing all the reinforcers. The analyst's name is Jackie Potter again. She gets very offended by this bullet because this means she didn't do her job. Nevertheless, we did an integrity analysis. It wasn't perfect. It'll never be perfect, but it was fairly high. The problem with blocking is this. If the behavior is maintained by a continuous reinforcement schedule, every time this happens, there's a reinforcer. And you block, let's say, 95%. You've now turned it into an intermittent schedule. And that intermittent schedule, if anything, might strengthen the behavior. I can't help but think that poor integrity blocking, which is the only integrity blocking, is yielding these intractable levels of stereotypy. And that's precisely what we're seeing here. I really think it's the last bullet that's perhaps most important, in that we did not deal with the motivation. When you block, you're basically saying, let's just do this assumption. Let's speak non-technically. We're saying that they're motivated to engage in this behavior to get some wanted outcome. Blocking, you're basically saying, I know what you want, you can't have it. And then over time, what happens to that thing that they want? It's only going to get more and more valuable because we did not deal with the motivation to begin with. I think that's probably what's going on when we do these kind of blocking procedures. So what do we do next? What we do next is we add differential reinforcement. This is not new. This has been in the literature for quite some time, but this is the part of the process that I'm going to expand upon after this study. But here, when we add differential reinforcement, we see that the stereotypy goes down to near zero or zero levels in many sessions. A return to baseline shows that it's higher, so this demonstrates functional control over this addition of differential reinforcement. Let me make it clear what this looks like. This is differential reinforcement, meaning that play behavior yields the reinforcer. The reinforcer is not Cheetos or cookies. The reinforcer is access to their own stereotypy. So the analyst named Jackie would be behind the adolescent. She wore sweatbands. It was very funny looking. She would have her hands like this by the young man, and she would prompt that young man to play. Were he to engage in stereotypy, she would try to quiet the hands. When he engaged in a criterion amount of play behavior, she would then turn the wheelie chair back off and say, do it. She'd model it. Do it. It's okay. Okay, made it very clear she's not available. 30 seconds later, she would go back, hands up, a signal that blocking is going to occur, prompt to play. If they met the criteria, she would turn the chair, move away, and say, do it. So the reinforcer here, let's be clear, is access to one's own stereotypy. That's the reinforcer that we're using to, one, strengthen play behavior, but also to inhibit stereotypic behavior. It's kind of paradoxical. We're using the reinforcer stereotypy to inhibit stereotypy. Okay. And we see decent effects. Those effects were replicated with our second gentleman. So when differential reinforcement in the form of access to his own stereotypy was added, we see a decrease to near zero levels. A reversal to baseline shows elevation, showing that the DRA was a critical component. We also saw an increase in the play behavior during this phase. We have a third participant, which we messed up the component analysis, so I couldn't talk about him until now. But nevertheless, when we add blocking for this gentleman, stereotypy goes down to low levels. We see a really nice increase in play behavior. We also stretched the schedule out. So there was 10 basically play units before the young man gained access to 30 seconds of his own stereotypy. And we weren't prompting play anymore. So this was independent play. Now please understand, this is fairly unimpressive for most people. Well, they're playing independently with blocks. But these gentlemen had no what we call outward directed behavior. All their behavior was allocated towards stereotypic behavior. So we were happy with this initial outcome. Okay. We then use this treatment, provide activities, prompt, block, while providing differential access to stereotypy to shape discriminated play behavior. Our goal is to teach these guys repertoires. Now I want to be clear, we're still working with these gentlemen. This is a slow road. These are adolescents. We're also applying it to young children, which is clearly where the promise is. But nevertheless, we can still help these young men. These are what we call interstars. You have these in New Zealand at all? Interstars? They're cute little building toys. They have little notches. The play behavior was pretty much putting together in any sort of way. We're trying to see if these gentlemen could follow a model and start to build things, and hopefully, like other young children, start to extract sensory reinforcers from this play behavior. Perhaps this is the first step. So this is an H-beam and an I-beam, and this is a cube, and we're trying to get the gentleman to build a couple cubes so they can then start making houses and have some fun. And so this is complicated. I'm not going to go through it piecemeal, but basically the yellow is an escalating response requirement. The first is put an I post on an I bar, and then put 2 posts on an I bar, and then you get up to building a cube, building and stacking 2 cubes. And as you can see, over time we use this treatment to shape this repertoire of building. Okay, so this is a powerful contingency. It leads to discriminated behavior because the child's properly motivated to learn. And this is something that 15 years prior apparently was not the case. That's the good news. The sad news is that when we let John go back into the space with just the materials, we see absolutely no generality of the treatment. He goes right back to engaging in stereotypic behavior, which really speaks to the chronic nature and the difficult to treat nature of this behavior. For a different gentleman, Edward, we used Legos to have him build houses. And you see with Edward, we escalate the requirement. This is the play behavior. It's occurring almost to the exclusion of stereotypy, which is really nice. And what's really nice with Edward is he is, when left alone, sometimes playing with the toys and sometimes to the exclusion of stereotypic behavior. Okay, so again, this contingency is still being applied at New England Center for Children with Edward to teach him play skills that might someday prevent stereotypy when left alone. Let's reflect on this and then move towards technology that we use more often. Javier, can you remind me of time so I don't mess this up? How are we doing? Anybody?
You've got about half.
Oh, look at that. You have clocks too. Okay, good. Put them on walls. These are important questions because I want to make it clear this is kind of a strange thing to do to another person. To gently karate chop them repeatedly and then give them access to their own behavior. There's a lot of people that are a little skeptical, is a polite word, about what we do as applied behavior analysts. And there's bloggers out there that worry perhaps about the intrusiveness of what we do. And let me be clear, that is intrusive. Okay, so we ask questions like this to the staff. Is this a humane treatment? Are you willing to implement it? We also ask the learner themselves, what do you think about this treatment relative to other treatments? I'm going to show you those data now. So we ask these questions to staff and we get good outcomes. Staff is okay doing this, and in fact they've been doing it now for at least 2 years with these gentlemen. This is what we call social validation. This is an important part of behavior analysis. We don't just show that we can change behavior, we show we can change behavior in ways that people find acceptable. And that waxes and wanes a bit. So the process of social validity is important to make sure we have a technology that's usable. But this is really what I want to get to. I'm just going to show you a little bit of data, but I wrote this paper a while back, and this paper is all about how we can have an objective process for determining preferences of people who cannot communicate to us with words. Okay? We can figure out the preferences of the people we serve for what we do. I do not like being in a room with advocates telling me what I can and can't do based on some shared humanity that is largely made up. What I like to do is know what works and what do the clients prefer, And that's all the data I need. Maybe what the parents and teachers prefer. Those are the three legs that support the things I do. So let's talk about how we do this. For these gentlemen, we put colors in these three different tables. We then, we first pick the colors by doing a color preference assessment. Each time they pick a color, we give them a grape or some kind of healthy snack. And we look to see that there's not a big hierarchy in the percentage chosen. In other words, they don't have a strong preference. And we try to pick colors that seem to be selected equally often. We then put them at these tables and we redo the assessment again, and we have them pick a seat. No matter what seat they pick, they get one grape. We call it non-differential consequences. In other words, if there's any difference, it must be controlled by the color because the consequence is the same. And we see with this gentleman that he picked, this is a cumulative record. So each selection bumps the line up, and you can see the lines are all moving in an upward direction, which means he's picking cheers about equally. Then what we do is we correlate different treatments with those colors and those cheers. So if he were to pick pink going forward, he would go to the cheer, and the analyst would simply block. No toys, they'll just be blocking only. Or he could go to the cheer. The analyst would stay over here, make it clear that there was no blocking whatsoever, and there were preferred activities to the extent which we could identify them. And they could do what they want, engage in stereotypy or engage in the play behavior. Or there's the full treatment. Activities, blocking, but were they to play, access to their own stereotypy. Okay, that kind of dynamic. So we want to see if when they pick this card, they're going to experience this, they're going to come back out, have another opportunity to pick a card, and through experience, they should start picking one card more often. And that which card they pick is an indicator of their bias or preference for a particular intervention. So I want you to give thought for a minute. Which one do you think they're going to pick? Think about it. And here are some results. John, when we put in the differential consequences in the form of treatments, John basically said, I am okay with activities only or with the full treatment, but please don't put me in a condition where you just block my stereotypy. That's essentially what John is advocating here, we believe. Okay, his preferences for these is showing indifference between these two, but clearly discriminated, responding away from blocking. When we put the grape back, it goes back to indiscriminate performance. For Edward, Edward showed a slight preference in baseline for hot pink, which is good for John. Nevertheless, we correlate them with the different treatments. When pink is now correlated with blocking only, he selected it but once. We have forced exposure if you're into this sort of thing. So there are some forced experiences to teach them the correlation. That just means we have them select them 6 times so they experience the differential outcomes, and then we allow them to choose freely. But what was really interesting right here is Patrick chose the treatment package. Okay. He didn't choose to sit at a table and just experience activities only and stereotypy as much as he'd like. When we look at Edward's data, we saw a similar outcome. He too chose the treatment package over blocking only and activities only. So let's summarize. No one prefers blocking only. So if you're an applied behavior analyst in the room, okay, let's all get on the same page. That is not an effective nor humane treatment for stereotypy is to only block. We now know that good treatments need to be comprehensive. Our literature is full of bits and pieces because we are analysts and we analyze those bits and pieces in research. But please understand, in practice, those bits and pieces need to be synthesized for an effective outcome. And this is just but one of many examples. No one avoided the treatment with all 3 components. In fact, 2 or 3 preferred it. So I want to make something very clear. This is a gentleman with 3 gentlemen with autism. They could go to a space and engage in stereotypy to their heart's content. Or they could go to a space where the analyst is blocking their behavior and then saying, go ahead, engage in your own behavior. And they're saying, this one, please. So this is what I mean by an advocate that has no empirical basis is a tough gig. Okay? And usually you're wrong as an advocate. This is pretty straightforward evidence suggesting that what we do as behavior analysts, arranging contingencies, is okay because the clients are telling us that's a context that they want to behave in. I guess the question is why? I'll remove that slide. I want you to give thought. Why? Why would these gentlemen choose that? We got to be careful interactive because I'll lose time, but can anyone give some ideas because I'm going to need to write a discussion someday. And good. Expand on that, please.
The idea that if you inhibit access to a particular behaviour, that behaviour will become reinforcing or more reinforcing than all of the other available behaviours?
I think that's super. You're smart. It's wonderful. I think that. I have no data to support anything we're about to discuss, okay? But that's as valid as anything I've come up with. That's super. So if you restrict access to a behavior, it might motivate the child to engage in some other behavior to then access that reinforcer due to response deprivation. Lovely.
Could it also be because in the treatment package they're also getting access to attention, which might also be fairly preferred?
There you go. People say that usually first, okay? And I think that's reasonable. However, that functional analysis showed us that when we provided attention following stereotypy, if anything, the base rate for all kids went a little lower than alone, okay? Which suggests that if anything, attention functioned maybe as a social punisher, not a reinforcer. Now, is it possible that over time the function of that interaction changed? Perhaps, perhaps. So it's possible. I don't think it's as likely though, possible.
Could because they had something else to do.
Well, I mean, the thing is, in the activities only, they have activities, so they have something else to do
But they were
there.
learning to do something.
Yeah, maybe the learning. Yeah, we can get real fuzzy with this conversation, Drew. Yeah, they like to learn, that sort of thing. We've gone down that path too. This is my favorite, though. I'm not saying it's more relevant than what you're saying. We have a whole host of other studies, and basic research have a whole bunch of studies showing that people and non-human animals prefer contingencies. We prefer to be in context where there's an if and then there's a then. We prefer context to work over receiving things for free. Okay, so we give kids whose problem behavior is maintained by, let's say, attention, the opportunity to go in a room and get attention for free, or go in a room and work a little bit for attention. All kids choose to engage in some behavior to produce those reinforcers. Behavior analysis is all about contingencies. That's what we do. It's all about timing. We don't introduce new things if we're doing our job really well. We just rearrange the environment so the good things are well timed and following the repertoires that we want to see again and again. And that's about contingency. I think what we do is preferred by the people we serve. And maybe this is an example. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that part of that though is about, especially for kids with autism, it's about the predictability? Like, and I know that even, like, often we'll put things onto a variable schedule, so
Yes.
it's not predictable in the way you think, but it's still like, at some point if I do this, this will happen. As opposed to, at some point where it doesn't matter what's happening, something's going to happen and I'm not sure when it's coming. And
Yes.
like, do you think that's part of the reason why there's this
I think that very well
contingency?
could be. Predictability and unpredictability to me is two exciting constructs in our field. And we really don't know which one is more preferred, more effective under the myriad of conditions with that question keeps popping out. My research group is trying to look at that right now. For instance, we have a study showing that kids prefer punishment, or a context involving punishment over a context involving extinction. So extinction, the kid's behaving and there's no change in the environment. There's no feedback, if you will. By contrast with punishment, it drives the behavior down, but it's a consequence that's predictable, thus avoidable. Certainly possible. But I also have other studies where kids are teaching us they prefer unpredictable contingencies to predictable contingencies. Just like, non-human animals prefer varied to fixed schedules and all that. So it's wide open. So if there's students in the room, this is a cool area. I'm curious. Okay. Couple take-home points. Stereotypy. Let's not assume function. It can be socially mediated. Second, it's important as practitioners to recognize the necessity of blocking. That's part of the treatment, but the insufficiency of blocking, not alone. Our goal is never elimination of stereotypy. If you want to make enemies in the world of autism, go around saying that your goal is to eliminate stereotypy. The goal is appropriate time and place, okay? And I think that's why these treatments tend to work, and it might be a little related to response deprivation, but said a different way, if you allow the person to engage in stereotypy at some times, you're better equipped to manage it at other times. In other words, the reinforcer is exceptionally powerful if all you do is block. By contrast, there's some ebbs and flows to the value of that reinforcer when you provide it at some times. Okay, so if the goal is this, have it occur at acceptable places and times, why not just gain stimulus control over the stereotypy? And many people have done that. Okay, so what I mean by that is this is a treatment that we published on a while back, and others have as well. We call it red card, green card. Under the red card, stereotypy is blocked. We might put the red card up when we teach. Under the green card, we allow stereotypy. That's called a multiple schedule. You alternate on a time-based manner between periods in which stereotypy is allowed and disallowed. We call that a multiple schedule. We had very mixed luck with multiple schedules. Sometimes they were okay, they drove behavior down, they never really did the trick for us. And we know why now, or at least we think we do. And I'm going to show you some data that speaks to that. Sorry for the complexity of this chart. These are data for Max, who was a young man who engaged in chronic stereotypy. These are data for Molly. What we're doing here is comparing a multiple schedule, which I just described to you, with a change schedule. A change schedule is the same as a multiple schedule, with the difference being there's a contingency built between the red and the green cards. Essentially, the performance during the red card affects whether they receive the green card. Okay, so in a multiple schedule, we would alternate between red and green based on time. By contrast, in a change schedule, we would rotate from red to green if they inhibited stereotypy and engaged in sufficient amounts of play behavior. So that's what I mean. There's a contingency in the change schedule between these two periods. So let's look at it during the S minus, which is the red card period. With the change schedule, we see this really nice and fairly consistent suppression in behavior. By contrast, in the multiple schedule, we see a lot more stereotypy attempts during that red card. Let's look over at Molly's data. We see a much better reduction in stereotypy during the red card, during the change schedule, than we do in the multiple schedule. Another cool bit of data that I really like is a latency to the first response when you change over the cards. And what we see here is during the change schedule, we see these exceptionally long latencies to respond in the change schedule, but we do not see the same in the multiple schedule. So what's going on here? When you build a contingency between these changeovers, kids learn to inhibit the response so they get quicker access to the green card, and the cards start to acquire stimulus control when there's a contingency between them. When there's no contingency between them, we're not seeing very good stimulus control. And sometimes we don't see any. Okay, so here with the change schedule, when you see it's down to 0, there's clearly stimulus control. In other words, they went from green, which is performance here. There's a whole lot of stereotypy going on in the green card. You flip over to the red card, 0. So that's not controlled by the contingency, by the prevailing contingencies associated with the red card. That's controlled by the red card, which is otherwise known as stimulus control. The simple take-home point is this. If you're attempting to gain stimulus control over a behavior, any behavior really, but especially automatically reinforced behavior, where people are highly motivated to engage in that behavior, it's terribly important that there's a contingency between the time where you don't want them to do it to the time you will allow them to do it. You have to motivate them to inhibit the response, do something else, pay it off with the transition to the green card, if you will. That was a little rushed. Any questions on that phenomenon? Another way to say the take-home point is contingencies matter, even at a second level. It's not just contingencies within the cards, it's contingencies between the cards. Okay. Let's talk, let me show you this too. We asked these kids, which one do you prefer, the multiple schedule, the change schedule, or just blocking only? Obviously, they didn't prefer blocking only, but Max preferred the change schedule. Molly preferred the change schedule too, but we almost kind of didn't believe her. So we said, are you sure? So we did more forced choice trials, and then we put Molly back in, and indeed, she has a preference for the change schedule. This is one of a dozen studies from my group, and there's many, many more from other groups showing that kids prefer contingent relations. Anytime there's any time-based relation in there, the kids tend to be stepping away from those contexts. Okay, I'm going to wrap up by telling you that's not the treatment we use right now. Sorry. But it taught us a lot. This is the treatment I use right now. And if you were at the workshop on our first day together on Monday, it's the same treatment we use for problem behavior maintained by social reinforcers. And I never thought this would work with folks with stereotypy, but we're seeing the best treatment effects we've ever seen with stereotypy, and kids are learning mands that never manded before because they're manding for their stereotypy. And there is no reinforcer for many children more powerful than that. Cookies, treats, mommy love, daddy love, stereotypy. That's the primary reinforcer for these guys. So let me show you what we do with this now. This is basically the treatment, but I'm going to walk you through it with the graph. That's ugly. I'll go with this one. Here we go. I put that one in there just to see. I didn't know how massive screens were in New Zealand. They're like in the States. This is, we have till 1:30, correct? Okay, great. These are data for a 11-year-old boy. he had no vocal verbal behavior. Okay, he didn't speak. He had some PECs, that's called picture exchange. He used them very minimally, and they weren't terribly strong responses. Okay, he mainly engaged in stereotypy most of the day. He did not learn much. His IEP goals, individual education plans goals, were rarely achieved. So we're measuring his motor stereotypy, which are the usual suspects that I talked about earlier. In baseline, when he's alone, he engages. There's a different measure. It's the percentage of the component in which he's engaging in these behaviors. You can see it's 100% at first. This is motor stereotypy, and we also are measuring vocal stereotypy, which is occurring at an okay rate. We're not intervening on vocal stereotypy. We're measuring it to see if we see concomitant changes in it. Okay. This is our latency to stereotypy. You can see it's not really 0, but it's at milliseconds. So the latency when we change these cards from red to green, how quick before he engages stereotypy, it's exceptionally low. This is his baseline. Okay. We're going to create one more baseline. This is the context the teachers want him to live in. This is where they want us to get some therapeutic gains. In this context, they say, well, if we allow him to engage in stereotypy, we'll allow him to engage in it, let's say, 20% of the time, but 80% of the time we want him to be in teaching. We want him to not engage in stereotypy so we can teach him something like that. So we try to emulate those component durations, and we start to instructing him in things that the team wants him to learn. Under these conditions, you can see that's the black data points represent when he was in the red card. Now, we haven't taught him what the red card means at all, but during the red card, he's engaging in a fair amount of stereotypy, but we're instructing him during this time, so it's less than during the green card, because there's no instruction. We're just looking at him and saying it's okay to do it. So we see a little bit of difference, but you can see there's a whole lot of stereotypy during the red card. I'm going to show you a different graph too. He's not communicating, he's not tolerating. We're going to measure those things. Let's look at his accuracy. This is his accuracy in the academic tasks we're getting at, and it's averaging about 25% accurate, so he's not learning much. Okay. Let's go back to this. The first step, we teach him to ask for permission to engage in stereotypy. Okay? And for him, the team want him just to say, play please. I don't like that. I like when they have a funny word. I like when parents label the stereotypy. Okay? But nevertheless, we went with play please. So it goes like this. He's at the table. During the red card, we go to instruct him, and then someone prompts him, say, play please. Okay? If we were to say, play please, they would then move away during the instruction, terminate the instruction, allow to engage in that behavior. Please understand there's shaping going on. So the prompt isn't say play please. The prompt is getting close. So we're just trying to get some phonemes out and shape up the term play please. We didn't have to do a lot of shaping. What you see is as soon as we did this, what we call functional communication training, during the red card, we see stereotypy go very low. Why is it so low? Because, sorry, I keep going the wrong direction. But he's engaging in this play please response, and he's getting out of, that's what these data show right here, he's getting out of the instructional context quite quick and getting access to his own stereotypy. So again, the first step is teaching him to engage in some behavior that's going to yield access, uninterrupted access to the stereotypy during the red card. During the green card, we just let him engage in stereotypy. After that, we teach him, we extend the response. He had to say, excuse me, may I play please, that sort of thing. And then we do tolerance training. So now it looks like this. He says he's being a champ. Every time we present the red card, he looks at us and says, excuse me, may I play please? We've been saying yes, yes, yes. Now we say no. Do this instead, match red, point to the letter A. We teach him just to say, okay, no problem. How do we teach him that? We prompt it, and if he says okay, we then let him engage in stereotypy. So he's tolerating denials of the question, may I engage in stereotypy? And you see this tolerance response now come online. It still isn't very impressive. It starts to get impressive now because now we put it into a three-legged proportional system. So it goes like this. He says, excuse me, may I play please during the red card. A third of the time we say yes, and he gets access to stereotypy. A third of the time we say no, do your work, and he says okay, and we say no, you're a good hand, disappointment, just engage in stereotypy. And a third of the time we say no, he says okay, we say match red, hand me the letter A, things of that sort. When he's compliant, When he's accurate a certain number of times, then we let him engage in stereotypy. Okay, not just based on attempts. We hold a high criteria. You have to get it right independently. And when you get X many right independently, then you get access to stereotypy. Okay. As you can see during this whole process, his stereotypy during the red card is exceptionally low. What's really interesting too is vocal stereotypy is characteristically lower during the red card, although we're seeing some unfortunate variability there. We're not intervening on vocal stereotypy, we're just measuring it. You can see his latency to engage in stereotypy is usually up here, which means behaviors under stimulus control. He doesn't engage in any stereotypy when we convert from red to green. The most important data, however, are these. During the red card, his accuracy is up through the roof. This is the first time the team has seen this boy learn conditional discriminations. Why is he learning conditional discriminations for the first time? It's not because these people weren't good teachers. This is from a behavior analysis program. They know all about micro teaching. They know more about it than I do. Okay? But it's because he's properly motivated. Because when they turn to the red card, he quiets his hands and he focuses and he does his little work so he can get access to stereotypy. But we don't only do that. We're not only paying off compliance, we're also teaching him to interact with us, to get out of his autistic bubble and to say, excuse me, may I do this now? And we pay that off immediately sometimes because we want him to talk to us. And sometimes we say, no, buddy, you can't do it, because we want to make sure that parents know you can say no to your children. And we teach them a skill to handle that. No problem. And we pay that off. These are what we call in other venues life skills: communication, toleration, and compliance. We strengthen them with intermittent and unpredictable reinforcement. Okay? In other cases, the reinforcer is that which is influencing problem behavior: escape and attention, toys. In this case, it's stereotypy. It's the same process. Okay? And this is the boy right now. These are fresh data. I just received these this morning. He's now at level 3. So what he's doing now is about 20, on average, 20 instructional trials. And his accuracy is up here. I don't get these effects. I just need to make it clear this, to those of you who may be unfamiliar with this field or what have you. I don't get these. And so this is really good stuff for us. So we're pushing this protocol and replicating it in a whole bunch of situations. Okay. Here's the final take-home point, and then we can chat. Well, a few minutes for chatting. This is really what I wanted to emphasize today. Treatments for stereotypy can be function-based. They don't need to be punishment-based. They don't need to be, if you're good, I'll give you a candy-based. Differential reinforcement of other behavior with arbitrary reinforcers. Punishment, that's behavior modification. It's not terrible, but what I'm trying to convince you is it's not necessary in these conditions. You can capitalize on, leverage the functional reinforcer here and its access to stereotypy. I think treatments need to be comprehensive. Please understand it's not just differential reinforcement. There's activities, there's prompting, so it's a fairly comprehensive treatment. But the primary component, as you saw in the component analyses, is a strong contingency. This is whether you're doing a simple differential reinforcement program like the first study I showed you, whether you have it nested in a change schedule, a little more complicated. Why does it work? Because of the contingency, probably. Why do kids prefer it? Perhaps because of the contingency. And then this last one still involves strong contingencies. In other words, there's no schedule thinning here. I want you to understand what it's like from the kid's perspective. They either engage in this much behavior, communication and toleration, communication, toleration, compliance. These are chains of behavior that always pay off with the reinforcer. Okay? Strong contingencies. No delays. Strong contingencies, just for chains of behavior that we want to stick around. Okay, that's all I got. It looks like we have 4 or 5 minutes if anyone wants to chat about something.
With the clients that don't have vocal responses and you're teaching that tolerance, how would you teach to say, yeah, okay, no problem?
Okay. The question was, how do you teach a child who is non-vocal, non-verbal, a tolerance response? And we historically have taught kids to do signs because they're so shapeable. We can mold their hands into an okay, I'm sorry, or this, or I like this one, no problem, that sort of thing. So we do that. But I tell you, this study is making me rethink these things. This boy never engaged in any vocal verbal behavior under any sort of stimulus control, and he's now communicating to us. He's engaging in lengthy interactive chains of vocal behavior. We thought he couldn't talk.
Right.
He can talk. He just needs to be motivated, and his motivation is his own stereotypy. So I used to kind of take the easy road and just say, well, they're not talking, so let's use PACs. They're not. So my goal now is just I go with vocal. I'm going with vocal. If I got a strong contingency, I'm going to start with vocal because that's where we want the child to land eventually. And if it's taking too many trials, then I might, certainly there's a speech-language path always in the neighborhood that we consult with, and we'd ask him or her. But again, historically, I would consult others and go with whatever topography they suggested. But now I just go right to vocal. I like to surprise the team. I like to show up to the team meeting and go, hey, look at this, he can talk. Do you see what I'm saying? I couldn't do that before. I just acquiesced and did what people told me, which I'm not a big fan of in general, as you can imagine. Dr. Mudford?
Yes. Do you come across children who regurgitate after meals and swallow as a stereotypic behaviour?
Yeah,
Or
rumination.
Air swallowing? In either case, you can't actually block the behaviour. So
Yes, it's a great question. Thank goodness I don't very often. I have a hard time with those behaviors from graduate school. Just tell you a quick funny story. There's an older woman. She supposedly didn't have much, her IQ was low, untestable and all this stuff. She had rumination. She would regurgitate. And I was walking around with a little personal fan. That was a reinforcer for her. She took my hand in the fan and she went. Like she knew some vector analysis and she got the thing right in my mouth. So, hope you had a good lunch. But basically, I don't see those behaviors that much, but I get that question a lot. And so I do want to talk about the remaining frontier of behavior analysis. It's truly a frontier, is automatically reinforce dangerous self-injurious behavior. We're still in the 80s, that the technology hasn't advanced much. I really think things like aerophagia, bruxism, rumination, those probably automatically reinforce behaviors. We, again, need to see if there's sense of the social environment first, but probably automatically reinforce behavior. They're kind of on the borderlands between these stereotypies that I'm talking about today and those dangerous SIBs, okay, as far as their controllability and their danger and all that. My take on it is first, if you can allow it to happen, I think we have to acquiesce and allow it to happen sometimes. Now, back to your main question is, but you can't block it, okay? So what do? What you have to do is come up with a punisher, and you have that punisher correlated with the red card condition. So let me give you an example. By punisher, I don't mean anything too intensive. Dr. Ahern, one of my colleagues in our program, he's a big fan of this thing called RIRD, Response Interruption Redirection. He uses it for vocal stereotypy because you can't block vocal stereotypy, or you shouldn't. And so basically it's essentially when someone engages in vocal stereotypy, you interrupt them and say, what's your name? Very good. Where do you live? How many fingers do I have up?
5.
Very good. Was that not a punishing experience? So that should dissuade you from engaging in that sound in the future. And that's mild social interruption and redirection is sometimes sufficiently punishing. Now, do I think that will be punishing for aerophagia, rumination? No. Those behaviors tend to have incredible strength. And so, but I think the goal is to, with the red card, enrich the environment to make that the lowest probability behavior that you can, and add in a differential consequence that might drive that rate of behavior down further. Now again, I'm extrapolating, but I think if I was charged with that tomorrow, that's what I would do this, that last thing, but I would have something to drive the behavior down via a competing reinforcement, complemented with some sort of punishment. Yeah. And again, if you're in a thesis-based ABA program, that's an area people will want to learn. If you can delve in that area of these, can you list them out again? Bruxism, aerophagia, rumination. What are those other ones on the borderlands?
just after lunch, I'll leave the sort of more gruesome ones.
Oh yeah, coprophagia. If you don't know what it is, good. Look it up when you're safely at home. And yeah, okay, very good. Any other questions? We should probably wrap up. Maybe one more question.
Just thinking about the rumination.
Yeah.
So we did some work looking at different methods you could do for rumination. One of the things we found was that the most effective treatment was what was called liquid rescheduling. And basically it's because the response effort is so much
There you go.
faster. So
Yeah.
you could actually, as part of your treatment thing, be like, can I have a glass of water?
Yeah.
So do you know what I mean?
There
Like
you go.
that's your request sequence. So
Yeah.
you're only going to get one treatment opportunity per
Yeah,
minute.
your
It's gonna be
trials-
you're getting.
that's
You're getting
right.
less trials, but
Yeah.
that may be a way of using your method for regurgitation.
I think that's a good
Our
point.
experience was like we went through the literature and found, you know, the peanut butter, the meal rescue, you know, same sort
Did
of
you
thing.
do
and
the
we-
bread thing?
Yeah,
that,
we tried all these different things, and it was only with 2 clients, but reliably it was the liquid rescheduling that like just and we had a client and she was like bent over like.
You're
And
trying.
it was just the responsive that like of trying to get it up, and as soon as she had liquid, it was easier. So maybe. But,
I think that's a super point. And I can't help but add on that rumination in particular, I can't help but think is a multiply controlled behavior, that there's some automatic reinforcement, but it contacts such wild social consequences that I can't help but think a lot of times those are also controlling behavior, and we need to be mindful of both. Multiple control between social and automatic is very rarely discussed, but I think it's fairly prominent for those sort of behaviors, you know. Again, it's a pleasure talking to you all. Thanks a lot.